That's right, ladies and gentlemen, it's another video game industry bad video. Do we need more of these? Well, the industry hasn't so much as slowed down the garbage truck, so... Last time I ended the video imagining you asking me why people are so mad at video games, specifically video game companies. And, like the last video, more than focus on specific things, what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of zoom the camera out a little bit. Not as much as I did in the other video. I'm not going to give you a history lesson on how art industry started. Actually, that might be fun. I'll save that for another video because I literally just convinced myself to do it, but I'm going to be sort of zooming out on the badness of the video game industry as a whole. I mean, it's super easy to find a billion videos, each focusing on one single bad thing any one company has done, but I want to sort of look at all of the bad things as a single entity, rather than a bunch of separate fuck-ups. Now, I do want to say, first off, this is going to be a very mean video. I've made some videos about how things are bad before, but this one might be my most vitriolic. I know that's why most of you are here, but you know, just in case, I thought you should know. Also, for real content warning, there is a lot of talk about sexual assault in this video. And before we get started, like I alluded to earlier, this is a sequel video to another one. There's a link to it in the description, and you should probably watch that one first, because I do reference it a couple times throughout the video. It's not necessary, but it'll give you the context you need. So let's ask our first question of the day. Is the video game industry bad? Or, more accurately, everyone says the video game industry is bad. Is it that bad? Yes. Well, okay, how? Well, it's an art industry. It's an industry that produces art. Okay, well that doesn't sound bad necessarily. And no, purely being an art industry, an industry that sells art, doesn't make you bad, but it just sort of ends up being bad. Essentially, art companies are not out to make art, they are out to make money. Now, of course, smaller ones might put the art first, knowing that putting out art that's challenging in a special way will bring them money from people who care about the medium, but when they become big enough, it usually ends in wildly favoring making money over anything else. You know, they're businessmen who run a company that hires artists to make art, or that owns a subsidiary company that hires artists to make art. The big company essentially is in charge of giving them the money for their art and giving them distribution and advertising. They also have legal teams to make sure no one takes the art from the company or misuses it, however they feel that would be. They also end up with the final say on how art turns out, and usually they're not really interested in what is good, they're interested in what they have data saying will make them money, or what has worked in the past. Now, this is all, again, generally very neutral. None of this is intrinsically bad, so let's look at how it can be. A lot of these algorithms and charts and graphs that the companies use can lead to massive artistic stagnation, where no one is trying anything and any attempts at emotion ring hollow because you've seen all these gears move a million times before. And someone might try to make something that does break the mold and be really outside the norm, and have their whole shit shut down because of a fear that it might not resonate with enough of the people that the corporation thinks are fucking morons who just want to eat swill, even if a lot of times they're completely wrong. These companies essentially decide what art can be seen by the public, and what can't, by giving a small few companies vast platforms and resources to share their art. Platforms and resources that smaller companies that are universally kinder to artists just won't have, because of a good old tendency towards oligopoly. And now, of course, these small studios do exist, but they're not exactly competing, because the smaller studios are just so hopelessly outmatched. I feel this was put best in an article about Marvel fans attacking Scorsese.
The reason all this should worry you, even if you have zero investment in superheroes or their relative position vis-a-vis a film culture as a whole, is that the response to Scorsese is a populist groundswell in service of the status quo, of corporations, and of power. Functionally, it's a mass movement rising up to defend a Goliath against the impertinence of David. It's unlikely that superhero movies will ever drive adult dramas and foreign language films and independent movies out of multiplexes entirely, but it's impossible to imagine the opposite happening.
There are the legal teams, which can be used to actively hurt artists that work for the company. For instance, if you create a character, or even if your company, Bungie, creates a character, like Master Chief, you don't own it. Microsoft does. And they can just give him to someone else, and there's nothing you can do about it. Or, for instance, if you're treated badly at the workplace via overworking or sexual harassment, you could try to sue, but the legal team that these studios have would make it nigh impossible for you to get anything out of it. Because taking away artistic freedom is just the tip of the iceberg, and that iceberg goes all the way down to physical and sexual assault of artists who have become employees, and have signed contracts to people who have incredibly powerful friends in the industry at large, and saying anything at all would guarantee that they never got a job in that industry again. And, because it is an art industry, it is going to be very hard for them to find a job anywhere else with their skills. And it's probably the job that that person and anyone who would risk their job by speaking up on that person's behalf has wanted since they were a kid. So, to sum everything up, at best, these large platforms focus on profit over expression and therefore make mindless, feelingless trash made by an algorithm to appeal to the widest audience possible and make the most money. And because of the platforms, if anyone dares to go outside the norm, they run an even greater risk of being widely ignored. At mediumist, they hold massive oligopolies, or just straight fucking monopolies, that stranglehold an entire and sometimes adjacent industries in an attempt to bulldoze the smaller pieces of art in favor of their own. And at worst, it allows these companies to actively abuse their artists and employees and face relatively no consequences. Though the Me Too movement has been helping with the last one. So, essentially, it's bad for art, and very bad for artists. But this is how it is with all art industries, and video games are only one of those. So, what makes the video game industry special? Now that is an interesting question. So, corporations are bad, and they do bad things. Corporations do bad things a lot. So much that the word corporation doesn't really ever make us think of bright sunny days. It's generally a negative phrase. When we think of a corporation, what we probably think of is pigs sitting on big piles of gold coins, big bellowing smokestacks, and people clocking in from 9 to 5, getting their souls sucked away. And needless to say, this isn't an entirely accurate view of corporations in the real world. You know, they're way worse. But this might be what you imagine when you hear the word. But video game corporations are exceptionally bad in a very special way. I feel like the best way to explain how is to look at a very interesting thing. Consumerist, a now defunct news site, held a yearly poll to decide who was the most hated company in America. In 2012 and 2013, EA Games won. And more recently, as of 2018, USA Today listed them as the number 5 most hated company in America, beating the Weinstein Company, Monsanto, and the Trump Foundation. Now, if you haven't been embroiled in the video games conversation for the better part of a decade, your reaction to that might be, what? Fucking why? They are really far from being one of the worst companies in America. And, as far as morality goes, that's completely true. But let's throw that out the window and think like a businessman, because through that lens, I think a case can be made as to why it deserves its position. Hey, what's up guys? I've properly acquired the correct mindset, now I think we can deep dive into why EA really is the worst company. So sure, EA Games doesn't have as many OSHA violations as Tesla, they aren't actively working towards global annihilation like ExxonMobil, they're not using as much legitimate slave labor as Nestle, and they've never had right-wing military groups kill their political opponents like Coca-Cola has. Or Tesla has. But here's the thing. Now, let's take ExxonMobil, for example. So ExxonMobil is an oil company that's the 5th largest harbinger of the doom of the human race. Their business is actively marching us towards our death and making just a ton of money. Super jelly here. But if people look at it through that window, they might dislike what they see. Which is why on the surface, if you were to look at them, They're very bright and shiny. They want to give you a good deal and treat you like a friend. And they want to give you a good service, whether you're a dude buying oil for your car or a corporation buying plastic. And they do this so that you'll come back to them again for all of your miscellaneously Texas tea related needs. They don't fuck over the customer in a blatantly overt way that might make the customer go, hey, what the fuck? Whereas EA does this almost constantly and has done for so long, it's a running joke. I'm sure their PR team has just given up because honestly, I don't think there's any coming back for them. Let's look at some of the things they did in 2011 and 2012, the years they won those shitty awards, in no particular order. They tried to add an online pass that would have forced people to pay to play games online on the PC, and got so much backlash they needed to stop. Announced they'd put microtransactions into all their games, invented the phrase on-disc DLC, essentially locking parts of a game someone paid $60 for behind another paywall. SimCity was released with always online DRM, horrible server issues, constrictive cities, a ton of bugs, less content than SimCity 4, less city size than SimCity 4, and was overall a huge piece of shit that was $60. They began shutting down always online games, keeping you from playing them ever again, like SimCity Social and The Sims Social, and directly stating that they wouldn't discount their games from $60 on Origin like Steam did because, and I quote, "We're not trying to be Target, we're trying to be Nordstrom," being both a hilarious comparison of quality and totally forgetting about the Nordstrom rack. You know, if they were a pure little company outside of all that, that might be something different. But, you know, we all make mistakes. And in those very same years, they said the reason they got those awards was because of homophobes, which just kind of a bad look, had it implied that they had hired anti-gay protesters to protest them, similar to how they'd hired Christian protesters to protest Dante's Inferno in 2009, got sued by the NAACP over using the likenesses of football players, got sued by Zynga for basically stealing their game concepts, got sued for falsely advertising how long a game would be alive, tried to sweep the fact that they used real-life gun manufacturers for a charity drive under the rug by removing their links from the Medal of Honor Warfighter page, and had their CEO step down because of all of this. So instead of doing what everyone else does, putting on a smile for their customers and hiding their corpses in a closet, they put their corpses in a closet and then explain to their customers that you need to suck me off if you want to play my games. So the reason we put on our as a businessman hats and threw our humanity to the wind for a second is to look at it in a way that sort of explains why EA won those awards. In a way, they were the worst company in America because not only were they inwardly terrible, they were outwardly terrible to their customers. I mean, right now, you're a businessman. So who gives a shit if you force your employee? Now, that would mean you'd have to pay them, your outside contractors and interns, to work without paid overtime and then fire them after a project finishes and you get bored of grabbing their ass. You can get away with all that, but if you're bad to your customers, you'll be looked at more negatively no matter how good internally you are. And we know everyone makes mistakes. So if your customers don't like the way that you treat them, they're gonna go out of their way to look for more reasons to hate you, because they feel slighted. And if people are constantly looking into your corpse closet, you fucked up, my friend. When, on the flip side of that, if you're good to your customers, sometimes they will actively ignore the corpse closet, or try to keep other people from looking in. But we'll get to that in a second. However, if you want to make your business putting up signs that point to the corpse closet on, say, YouTube or your own published website, you can make a career out of doing that because they are constantly wheeling in new corpses. And, you know, some might argue that you're doing a public good, keeping people informed. You know, not everyone wants to spend their time going out of their way. If you want to do all that, I mean, more power to you. Alternatively, of course, you could tell gamers how much it sucks that the other guys making the signs are pushing their corporate Marxist agenda on video games like Call of Duty that have no politics in them and that are just games. That's where the real fucking money is. Oh god, let's go away from there. Now, this isn't something that's unique to EA, it's massively widespread in the industry. Most recently, of course, the biggest perpetrator of this kind of thing is Activision Blizzard. The last year, on the back end, they banned 2 shoutcasters and a player for saying "Free Hong Kong" and made massive profits while laying off 800 people, and most recently, their employees started sharing a spreadsheet showing off the awful pay disparity. And recently, they released Warcraft 3 Reforged and put in their EULA, if you make a fun game mode like Dota and it becomes super popular using our mod maker, we fucking own all rights to it. We got Nintendo being bad to consumers by releasing a timed re-release of some of their 3D Mario games, while actively destroying ROM sites that archive games and are sometimes the only way to play a game without buying an old console and a copy of the game for several $100s, and destroying fan mods or remakes of their games that are built from the ground up and distributed for free. And Ubisoft, having some controversies with the Always Online DRM in 2011, and then 10 years later stagnating their games as much as possible to the point that they're literally reusing their maps, while underneath, for the entire whole-ass decade of time, having massive, widespread sexual harassment issues that go directly to the top of the company. And of course, like the horrible me said, if you want to spend your time making videos about all of this stuff, you'll be hard-pressed to run out of stuff, because you know, there are no brakes on the garbage truck. I mean, look at all of this garbage just on the consumer side. Battle passes, store exclusivity, loot boxes, microtransactions and $60 games, microtransactions as a whole, invasive DRM that runs at BIOS, invasive DRM that slows the game down, limited CD key uses, only online games, games with no physical copies, on-disc DLC, Day 1 DLC, DLC as a concept, paid online for consoles, lack of backwards compatibility, games costing $60, console exclusivity as a concept. But some of you might be thinking, some of those things are not like the others. And now, instead of confirming what you're thinking, I'm going to confront you with something. If you think some of these things are not like the others, why? And then I'm just gonna answer that question anyway, let's go! So let's talk about the 5 monkeys experiment. Some of you might be familiar with this one. An experiment once took place with 5 monkeys and a ladder with bananas at the top of it. Every time one of the monkeys tried to get the banana at the top of the ladder, the other 4 were sprayed with water. So, the monkeys stopped doing that. Eventually, one of the monkeys was replaced with a new monkey, and it would try to go for the bananas, and all of the other monkeys would beat it up. Eventually, all of the monkeys were replaced, and this happened every time, even when there were no monkeys that even knew why they weren't supposed to go for the banana in the first place. This is just how things are done. Now,
it's a good story.
It's not true, but it proves my point.
And my point here is, this entire idea and the "that's just how things are done" mentality are essential to the video games industry. Well, they're not. They could just not be the fucking worst, but to continue being garbage in this way, they need that mentality. So in this example of controversies, I put in some plans. Like for instance, paid online for consoles, games costing $60, and console exclusivity. Though, the lattermost one does have a good bit to do with hardware and firmware being extensively closed off and non-universal, which is really more of a tech world problem than a video games company problem. And really, I have a pretty simple philosophy on that. All power to the programmers! Let the Linux installmentist revolution rage! Open every single source and helicopter Microsoft HQ to Siberia! But the thing is, these other things were not always like this. For instance, paid online for consoles was really only an Xbox thing until the PlayStation 4. PS2 and PS3, you didn't need to pay for online, but you always did with Xbox Live. Same with online for the Wii and Wii U. So conceptually, games companies could have just turned away from this, but they didn't and decided that this is how things were going to be done. Also, AAA games costing $60 is the norm when it wasn't before. Originally, you could pick up the hottest title for around 20 to 30 bones. Now, of course, you could blame this on inflation, and that's no doubt part of it, but the price hasn't gone up in 10 years, and it used to be 20 to 30 bones. Whereas now, all AAA games are $60 as a fixed standard. And the reason for this is that the 7th generation came around and fucked everything up, and that's just how it is now. And we'll get into that more in a second. I feel like I'm saying that a lot in this video. Well, the reason I am is because all of this is kind of connected in a big spider web, but I'll get more into that in a second. But let's look at the way this is all propagated. So, game companies want to make more money. So they try to normalize things that will make them more money. If people as a community or society don't think that something falls under the fucking someone over umbrella, it isn't technically fucking someone over. So continuing to do things and plugging your ears when people complain is financially beneficial to you because you know, just wait a few years until people don't know any better. And say that anyone who says these things are bad is a utopian idealist and imply that it's always been like this when it hasn't at all. But they don't just use the slow march of time. With all of these plants I put in, I also put in recent controversies. For instance, EA's scumfuckery doesn't just start and end in 2011 and 2012. Recently, in Star Wars Battlefront 2, the new one of those, EA had a massive controversy regarding loot boxes by having some things you got in those loot boxes give you an advantage over other players who did not have those things. So, people have a general distaste for games being pay to win, especially online games where one person is playing against another person who killed them because they didn't put $5 into the game to be better. It's terrible. But loot boxes are random. So essentially, the game was now paid to have a slightly better chance at win. Gambling. So not only was this horrible and egregious, it was also being marketed to children, which prompted several EU countries to place heavy restrictions on loot boxes. And you've now heard all about how awful that is, right? Bet you forgot about how they're charging you $60 for this game. In fact, you might be using that as a point. If I'm buying the game for $60, why should I also pay for loot boxes if I want a chance at doing well? Which kinda stops you from asking, why am I paying $60? Much like art, milking your customers like fucking cattle is a group of branching pathways that sort of go in similar directions forward, and sometimes a branching pathway will outmode the previous one. $60 for a game isn't bad, if only because they're trying to fuck you even harder. And of course, these companies will defend themselves until it's costly to continue. But they will have their outside defenders, people who gain nothing from defending them, but do anyway. But if the bar is this low, you might ask, why? Others might answer, because they do nothing but chug boot polish. The fuck do you want? But I think we should give at least some of them the benefit of the doubt. So, to understand why, let's look at a small controversy, one that's a little more gray, and the people who defend the corporate side of that. So here's a little example. Recently, there was a controversy about Mick Gordon leaving id over the mixes of songs on the Doom Eternal album Kinda Sucking Ass, and recently id released a statement which mostly boiled down to Mick was on contract to get it done fast because we wanted the soundtrack out for the special editions release, and he was too slow, so we gave him an extension, and we gave him our sound mixer to help. And Mick said that it was cool, and that he could take on some of the workload. Unfortunately, Mick missed the deadline again, so essentially we had our sound mixer do a lot of the work. Mick said he was cool with that, so that's what we did. So when he got super fucking pissed about the mixes the guy did, we were surprised. We don't know what the fuck is going on or why he's mad, and TBH, we don't like him making fun of our sound mixer, who essentially just used what he was given by Mick. Now, I read this and think, based on his outrage with his baby being taken from him that he displayed, it's safe to say that he was probably never actually happy with working with that dude. And because of what I know about video games companies and how fast they expect you to do things, I also think it's safe to assume he wasn't just shirking responsibility, but actually, it probably took him longer than the time allotted to put out what wasn't a subpar production. Especially because the Doom 2016 OST came out 5 months after the game did. And this time, because of the popularity of his tracks in the last one, Mick was given a whole lot more free reign to go as crazy as he wanted, so this one would probably take more time than by the game's release date or even 1 month past. And that freedom is probably why he signed that contract and said he was okay with working with that guy. If he wanted to keep that freedom, id, and by extension Bethesda, didn't really give him another choice. Also, side note,
after listening to the 9 tracks he delivered, I wrote him that I didn't think those tracks would meet the expectations of Doom or Mick fans. There was only one track with the type of heavy combat music people would expect, and most of the others were ambient in nature.
Oh shit, I'm sorry, do you mean like these tracks? You know, the best ones in the game, but also it's safe to assume, because they'd said they'd release the soundtrack with the special edition, the deadline became a big huge deal, especially due to other problems with other special editions. Bethesda was probably breathing down its neck, because presumably they wanted to avoid controversy and needed a win. Oh god, our last 2 games were seen as either mediocre or actively bad, so a lot was riding on this game, and it probably was pushed into a corner. Basically, it's a whole mess. Now, most of the comments on this thread are people saying, oh, it sucks that Mick won't be in the next Doom game, it won't be the same without him. And yeah, that's a pretty good takeaway. But some of the comments...
This is what you call in most industries a burnt bridge. I would suspect, unless there is major public outcry, that which could be cost estimated to have an actual significant fiscal impact, it's unlikely anyone on the side of production would want to deal with a talent, no matter how talented, that not only did not deliver per the agreement, but also promoted bad faith between all parties involving the project. If all this reads true, the talent created and perpetuated circumstances that damage the overall reputation of the project. That is rarely acceptable behavior, no matter how talented the person might be. If Mick really couldn't be bothered to get shit done on time, then blamed id and deliberately threw the guy that had to fix his half-finished shit under the bus, I doubt it, and I don't want it. He agreed to do something by a certain time, and he didn't do it. If he felt that he was lacking the inspiration, desire, what have you, he shouldn't have agreed to it. The fact that you actually say the company fucked up majorly by anticipating he would come good on his word just goes to show how out of touch you are with how things work in the business/real world.
Now, of course, you could just say, well, yeah, these are Reddit comments made by Redditors. The reason they have their mouths open so wide in all of those pictures is so if a boot comes along, they're ready for it to go all the way into their throat so they can drag their tongue across every inch. And while that is a very fun image to animate, I think we should pull the camera back a little bit again. Now, most of these replies you might have noticed are doing that thing. This is how things work in the industry, without taking into account the question, should they be? Now again, let's not assume the worst. Let's not assume that they would answer yes to that question, or that they are deliberately hiding that, because I honestly think we can very easily give these people the benefit of the doubt here. Because I think there's a little thing we as people just sometimes automatically assume, no matter how punk we are. And that is that the status quo is there for a reason. And that reason is that it is the best outcome of all of the others. That some people, at some point, looked at all the options and, with the person who is defending them in mind, decided that the status quo was the best one. Even when that's not true, and even when that decision affects them more negatively than it does positively. Unless these guys work for id or Bethesda or profit from the games industry operating like this, all they're getting out of this is a shitty track mix and no Mick Gordon on the next Doom game. But they defend it anyway. Now, of course, if they do think the video game industry should continue operating like this, and they are profiting off of it, then they have abused my benefit of the doubt and can suck my fucking cock. So when, and I want to assume most people say that's just how it works, they're not being malicious, they're just assuming it's the way it is because it's the way that it should be, because it's the best that it can be, because they think the way it is was made to benefit them and not harm others, when that could be very wrong. But if you were to ask them if it should be better, they might respond and you might be thinking, yeah, okay, it's not the best, but it's how it is, so what's the point in asking at all? Well, because we might want to change the way things are, and if they could be better, we could demand that they get better, and the best way to do that is not be a fucking bootlick. No, essentially the best way to start is by asking these questions and focusing on what the world could be, rather than what the world is. So if we answer, yes, it could be better, we can ask how to make it that way. And the answer we're going to get is a tough one. And it's one that you as an individual will have to take a minuscule part in changing most likely, but you are far from alone, and every single step taken by every single person is another step forward in making it that way. And the larger the consensus is that things should be better, the better of a chance we have at making them that way, in one way or another. And of course, this particular example is small baby shit compared to the big stuff that's really bad, especially because I don't think id was being as malicious as they could have been, in the grand scheme of things, but it's a fun example to use for the mindsets of the video game company defender men to keep in mind when we do get to the bad shit, where it's really easy to assume these people are just being fucking malicious. So why don't we do that now? Let's talk about crunch. So, for the blessedly uninitiated, crunch used to mean overworking your employees when a game is almost done to get it done by a deadline, which is bad. You see, okay, cards on the table, I'm on the never overwork your employees ever side of the argument, but now I do say used to mean that though, because now it seems to mean overworking your employees the entire time the game is in production, or just never not overworking your employees. Now, the definition didn't change like I think most words did. You know, people started using it to mean one thing and then started using it to mean another. But this one sort of evolved because employers told their employees that they would be crunching to finish a project. And then that crunch to finish the project turned into crunch to finish the day one patch, and crunch to finish the subsequent bigger bug fixes, then crunch to finish the content patches as the player base dwindled, and slowly crunch became crunch. Now this sort of gained its big stage as being a huge problem when it came out how this was being done by Epic's Fortnite team and Rockstar's Red Dead Redemption team, having 100-hour work weeks. After that, it turns out most AAA game companies had been doing this malignantly for years because nobody really tried to stop them. Most recently, Naughty Dog worked its employees so hard for The Last of Us 2, the director of the first game left and a guy was sent to the hospital. Now, I could explain why this is bad, and I will. A man was sent to the hospital because they worked him so hard. Now, I could go on about this more, especially when the crunch there is so bad, anyone in the know about the industry straight up will refuse to work there, but I feel like it might be more pertinent of me to kill two birds with one stone. Because, the thing is, this is so widespread, sometimes companies will do this, and people will turn a blind eye. Now, not because they don't think this is a bad thing to do, but because they like the company that is perpetuating this bad thing, and they can shrug it off, because that's just how things are done. So we're gonna talk about CD Projekt Red. In my previous video and in my Witcher video, I talked about how great I think The Witcher 3 is, and I love it and think it's an incredible game. But the crunch? Now this will not do. I really can't abide by that, and I don't think that that is incredible. But for a while, I was one of the people who did defend CD Projekt Red. So let's talk about my journey through that. And let's have some fun with it too. January 2019. So I finished the first 2 Witcher games, and they're just as great as I've been told. The third one especially, I'm not even finished with it, and it's raising the bar for storytelling in a game. With this level of improvement over the other 2 games, I cannot wait to see how high they raise the bar for Cyberpunk. I mean, I loved that hour-long gameplay trailer they released. It's just fun to watch. It's better than the pilot for most TV shows. The world building is incredible, and the characters are already interesting. God, this game is going to be a blast, and I am super hyped. March 2019. So, they released a new PlayStation spot for Cyberpunk about the creating of it. It even had Geralt do the narration. That was pretty fun, though the co-founder of CD Projekt Red said some things that kinda worry me. He said,
"This was probably the most stressful E3 of my life, and I don't know why, but I just couldn't deal with the pressure. I was actually a shadow of myself at this E3.
And he looks so haggard. I'm sure to make great art, you gotta work hard, but damn, dude, take a nap. Shit, sorry. I got bit by something earlier today. It's probably nothing. Like, it doesn't hurt or anything. It's just kinda itchy. April 2019. So, apparently that thing with the co-founder of CD Projekt Red wasn't just hard work. They've been crunching like that for years, even when making The Witcher 3, and this isn't just a new revelation, this is something that they talked about back in May 2017, and shit, this really sours the whole thing for me. Like, it's been like that for years. So, side note, I think I'm gonna go back to wearing all black. I mean, I've had this weird urge to start dressing more colorfully, but I don't know, it just feels like black is better, you know, it's my whole aesthetic. May 2019. Well, I got good news. It turns out CD Projekt Red said they'd work on their crunch, and, I feel really happy about that, you know? I mean, they heard people's complaints, and they're gonna change it up. You know, that's great! November 2019. Hey there, folks. Now, I do gotta say, I'm not super happy about crunch in video games. You know, I think it's bad and wrong. But CD Projekt Red did do crunch, and they were called out and decided to change the culture of the studio, and you know, good for them. I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt, and we ain't heard much bad coming out of that studio, so it's a good bet that they kept good on what they said. Oh, Christmas is coming up, and I sure do hope Santa brings me some new shoes. Ooh, you go through them quick. Also, he might need to bring me some bigger ones. Ladies, you know what they say about dudes with big feet. January 17th. So, Cyberpunk got delayed today. Why am I laughing, you might ask? Well, I think that's just great. I mean, if they're not working on crunch time, that's not super surprising. But it might be a sign that they're actually trying to stop the crunch in the workplace and adjusting their company accordingly. They're really doing it. I knew all we needed to do was have a little faith in them. January 18th, 2020. Cyberpunk 2077 developers will be required to crunch following its delay. But of course, it was at that point that I took off the makeup and put my shoes away. And while I wasn't the only one, I very rarely see other people do. You see, CD Projekt Red is kind of revered in our video game communities as the least garbage company, because they put out really good games. So, whenever Cyberpunk comes up, people really only talk about how excited about it they are, in a way that people didn't talk about The Last of Us 2, for instance. Even though not only did it have the same problems, but CD Projekt Red said they were going to fix those problems, and then just absolutely backpedaled on it when they announced the delay, which is an exceptionally shitty thing to do. And, in the end, I don't think people really mind getting a game pushed back at all. When people talk about Valve time, they're not saying it in a mean way. Valve time is good. It keeps your people from getting overworked, and gives you enough time to get it out when it's ready. Like, this is almost never going to get you dogpiled by gamers, and look at how great every Valve game has been. Essentially, the best thing to do is to take your time. You know, unless you're actively charging people $270 to go to a dinner to announce spaceships that cost another several $100s for your entirely crowdfunded game that has been in alpha for nearly 10 years. But that one's it's like a weird case. But I gotta say, it is tempting just to ignore all of that. Because Cyberpunk does look good as hell. And I do want to just push that shit out of my mind and not think about how those people are being treated and just be excited. But, I can't do that. I mean, I can, but I should not. Because that's how it became so malignant in the first place. And it's what I see a lot of people doing. I see a lot of people saying, it's just a game, who cares? I'll tell you who cares. The people being abused and the abusers. Because looking the other way helps the abusers. I've also heard a lot of separate the art from the artists. And unfortunately, when these people say that, they don't mean Cyberpunk looks good, but I absolutely cannot abide by CD Projekt Red's terrible crunch culture, and I refuse to ignore it, especially when the game actively comments on corporate culture. What they want it to mean is, I want to completely forget about the horrible things the company is doing, so I can play the game without feeling guilty for it. And that, of course, is when people are not outright defending crunch, which people do, in fact, do. And if you are one of those people, don't. That is bad. You will gain nothing from defending a company. They are not your people, nor are they your friends. Senpai will not notice you, and defending them will never put you in a position where they will. The luckiest you'll get is to be put in a position where they can abuse you too. And the reason I'm not assuming you're someone high up in a company defending it is because most of those guys are smart enough not to defend their own practices because it makes them look bad. Unless someone else defends them enough that they think they can normalize it. Now, of course, one of the people in that article was CD Projekt Red, but the other was Bethesda, specifically id, so they're not off the hook, especially not after having been purchased by Microsoft. That happened while I was editing the video, and Microsoft does not play friendly with unions. But of course, a lot of these people just want to go back to the halcyon days, where everything was shiny, and every 3 seconds a video game company didn't make a fucky-wucky. And, you know, that's a tempting thing to do, but we always gotta ask ourselves, did those days ever actually exist? Well, believe it or not, in this particular case, they kinda did. While crunch, I don't think, has ever not been a problem, there was a point where video games not being so covered in controversy all the time was the norm. Let's look at EA again, and I want to let you in on something. At one point, EA was not the great pariah of the industry. In fact, at one point, they were relatively well liked. And being bought by them was not necessarily a death sentence. It might have meant you'd get to keep doing cool things, but with a little more money. They published the Command & Conquer series, the Total War games, Medal of Honor, SimCity, The Sims, Civilization, Need for Speed, a couple Katamari games, a ton of licensed games that were actually pretty good, so what in the fuck, EA? How did you go from that to this? Well, let's ask some more questions. How come Ubisoft seems to only have a couple of properties they keep making sequels to? How come a Blizzard game hasn't had a good story in like 10 years when that was one of the things that they were really good at? What's the deal with all these Call of Duty games being the same? How come the only new IP Rockstar has come up with in the last 10 years has been LA Noire? So, essentially, how come all the big video game companies seem to focus on huge projects that are sequels to things that were already successful and don't make many smaller, slightly riskier games? And how come each of these games don't seem terribly unique? One of the things that I noticed looking for examples of games that pushed at the boundaries for the last video was that during the 2010s and the late 2000s, things just kinda stopped. Remember when we all said, like 10 years ago, that those big open-world GTA clones were super overplayed? Well, they sure were overplayed for a long time. Many would say that they still are hugely overplayed. During that entire massively long console generation, big open-world games were just what you made your game if you didn't want to make it a cover-based third-person shooter or a modern military shooter. Now, there were a few exceptions, of course, but those took what was already and put a little spice on it, which is good, but in the late 2000s and most of the 2010s, there weren't a lot of game changers, that created new ways of thinking about what games could be. When the previous decade had Grand Theft Auto 3, World of Warcraft, Half-Life 2, Halo, among others, which did change the game significantly. Well, there is Demon's Souls and Dark Souls, though, which were hugely influential, and I can't forget those. And you could argue that they are AA games and not AAA games, but for the sake of the argument in favor of the giant, abusive mega-corporations, let's say they count. Also, Bam-Ham combat was a thing for a while, wasn't it? I mean, I would argue that it's just a dumbed-down spectacle fighter, but again, let's give it to them. So, what happened? The 7th console generation happened, and it was rocky as fuck. With all of the new stuff that the previous generation had shown off and invented, the generation of the Wii, the PS3, and the Xbox 360 had everyone trying to do all of these things at once in their games, while also trying to have them look like this. Okay, but this was like a big deal at the time, and with all of this, the cost to make a game went up significantly, whereas the cost to make a game in the era before was anywhere from $5 to $7 million, with exceptions like big games like Half-Life 2 clocking at $40 million. The average 7th generation game was around $10 to $20 million, which is a lot more money. This increase of money was super hard for AA devs trying to make it, and many failed. Lots failed. Matt McMuscles' What Happened series is a great place to hear about those. So this is when the companies that are still kicking around today needed to veer much more quickly towards different strategies. Strategies that did not favor artistic integrity and treating your workers good. And games have just continued to sort of stagnate more and more. So if you're wondering why Call of Duty has been the same for one junior high schooler worth of time, and why games cost $60 now, it's because the cost in games just went way the hell up. So the companies that make them gotta play it safe and charge a premium. And yeah, I rag on Call of Duty a lot, but I mean, in their defense, the new one is going to have the first gender-neutral pronoun option and the first gender-neutral bathroom, so that's good. But yeah, this is where all of this started, with a focus on bigger games and more money in those games and more profit. But some of you might not be convinced that this constant upward swing is a bad idea. You might say, sure, there's some sameness, but these brands are huge. They have huge money behind them. And all of these companies are putting a ton of work and a ton of money into these games, and they're better for it. Do you think we could get these graphics with a smaller budget? Do you think we could have all these worlds be as open? How would you get games like this without the money they put in? So let's answer that by answering a different question that some people might have been asking for a while. So I said the 7th generation was kind of devoid of development, that the game-changing, the risk-taking, and all of the creativity of the previous decade of evolution kinda stopped. But what about Minecraft? And yeah, what about Minecraft? You see, there was a revolution in the 7th gen. When the AAAs were stagnating, the indies were having their own creative boom. I mean, you had Super Meat Boy reminding people that hard games could be fun. You had Dungeons of Dreadmore, Binding of Isaac, Dwarf Fortress, and Spelunky reminding people that permadeath roguelikes and roguelites could be fun. Amnesia recreated the entire horror genre in its image. Limbo, Journey, and Braid were giving people introductions and new ways of storytelling. Shovel Knight updating retro games, and then just like Undertale, just all around whipping ass. The revolution in the 2010s was an indie revolution. And today, in the AAA world, you do have your Doom Eternals and your Titanfalls, made by subsidiary devs of big companies, who the big companies have given a lot more free reign. But in the indie scene, you got Dusk, a game that was made by one guy that helped spark a new boomer shooter revolution, with games like Medieval and Wrath, Eon of Ruin. You're getting new innovations, things like Ultra Kill, a boomer shooter with a style meter. And then you have games like BPM and Metal Hellslinger, which are rhythm first-person shooters. And you have indie publishers, whose driving goal seems to be get good games the money they need, like New Blood, a publisher that specializes in boomer shooters, and published most of the games that I mentioned. And you got Devolver Digital, another one that seems to be devoted to both being the A24 of video games and talking massive amounts of shit about the AAA video game industry.
Tomorrow's unethical business practices today!
And like I mentioned earlier, it could be said that the biggest revolution that the AAA games made was the Souls-like revolution with the Dark Souls games. And so, indies took that and ran with it, whether adhering to the deliberate combat or creating faster Twitch skill versions, but keeping around the ambiance and the way the games told their story. And as technology has grown, the indies are able to look more like AAAs, or just create their own aesthetic. Animated, many times hand-drawn games are making big waves, and they are gorgeous. They're far from realistic, but they don't look worse by any means. Some look better. And that's it. The most damning thing I can say about the AAA games industry. The AAA games industry does all this horrible shit. It treats its customers like garbage while outright abusing its employees. It pumps all this money and blood into their games. And the end result of all that bullshit? The game ends up both worse and less culturally relevant than a game that lists 2 people in the credits and looks like it was made for the Game Boy Color. With a scant few exceptions, the AAA games industry is putting out worse games overall than the indies. Open world games? How open are they? Well, can you completely control the kingdom your character runs around in after conquering it? Can you start out on a desert planet and slowly build until you have a giant spaceship that can explore the stars? Or can you create an entire space empire with interconnected trading routes that's at war with the rest of the space empires? A war not created as a part of the story, where in the end you win, but one that you could potentially lose. And then, almost every time a AAA games company tries to revive an outmoded type of game for the fans, an indie dev or 3 shows up and just shows them up. Sure, AAA games have the graphical fidelity you're not going to get out of the indies. You won't see Toby Fox programming a photorealistic Reagan, but my point is, what good is a photorealistic Reagan if the game won't even let me piss on him? Naughty Dog said the reason they had their employees work to the bone to create long animations of people getting murdered was to give you a deep, visceral feeling. But then, you play Spiritfarer, a game made by 20 people, and see a single well-animated hug with a deer on a boat, and you're hit like a brick. And it shows that none of that shit was at all, in any way, necessary. Everything in the AAA games industry is needless. All this bad shit is in service of nothing. The big hot take I have for you in this video is another question that I am not the first to ask, but I feel like should be asked every time it comes up because it's one of those things that's just the way things are. Should we have a AAA games industry at all? Because it seems to me, at least with the games that I really like and the reasons I really like them in the AAA games industry, that all of those probably could have been done, or were done, with a AA budget. Nowadays, games can get upwards of $100 million per game. Why not take that money and make $55 million games? $5 million is still a lot of money. And if an indie dev had that much money, they'd be able to put out some really incredible shit. And we have indie publishers like Devolver that are doing that. And they're putting out some really incredible shit. Okay, so let's say we don't want any more AAA games industry. How do we do that? Well, best way to do it, I think, is we take a look at other art industries and see how we can. How have the older, grander art forms solved this problem? Well, in film, Disney has gained such a foothold over the industry by owning so many IPs they're able to bully theaters into submitting to their will, and they made over 80% of the money made at the box office entirely last year. And the rest of Hollywood has such a history with sexual scandal that my response to the inception of the Me Too movement in 2017 wasn't, oh god, I can't believe that such a prominent figure has been abusing women all this time. It was, holy shit, did they get sexual assault charges to stick on a Weinstein? Goddamn, never thought I'd see the day. Cause it wasn't like we all didn't know, it was just that no one could fucking do anything about it. The music industry has a massive history of just basically owning and controlling human beings, how they look and act if they want to keep their careers, and generally abusing them, sometimes sexually, to turn them into a brand to be consumed. One of the big recent examples of this was what happened to Kesha. The theater has essentially been relegated to one geographic location, and tickets to Hamilton are $200 to $1,150 a pop, making it an incredibly insular art form that throws anyone who isn't fucking rich and lives in New York out the window, and has what could be considered a pretty average sexual harassment and racism problem. By which I mean, if you know nothing about the theater, like me, you will probably have heard that both of these things are a problem. The comic book industry almost died in the 90s and early 2000s because it was mostly run by two companies who have been using the exact same characters since the 40s, and were saved by the film industry, an industry they've tried, somewhat successfully, to homogenize in much the same way. And recently, as of January, is also facing what the Daily Dot describes as another wave of sexual abuse allegations. The best way to display what the literary industry is doing is to look at how publishers sued the Internet Archive for archiving literature during a pandemic for the people who didn't have access to a library. Chuck Wendig, a man who helped open the floodgates for this suit by yelling at NPR for saying that archiving books was good, defended the publishers by saying the real people who were hurt by the archivings were the people in the publishing paid me hashtag. A hashtag where marginalized people show how much less they were paid by publishers than their white colleagues. And this industry is one of the easiest to feel sorry for because they're staving off monopolization by Jeff fucking Bezos. And Of course, each of these art forms has an independent market that goes widely unnoticed in the scope of the great big bastards at the top. So, yeah, maybe this isn't a problem with just video games. You know, this might just have something to do with that capitalism that we live in, making these things the natural evolution of an art form. You know, turning into an industry, and having that industry get so big it abuses its employees who are so excited to work in it that they'll do anything. But, you know, if we're looking at it through that lens, I'm sure the 500,000 homeless people in America staring at the 17 million empty homes they could be living in are just super choked up about artists not being able to do art enough. Oh, okay, yeah, they would probably be in agreement that the physical and sexual abuse is bad, and that is kind of my main point. So, anyway, like I said in the last video, people generally like art. They like the idea of art, and like it when artists keep moving the art needle forward. So, art is a good way to start a conversation, and show off some of the problems of the system we live in, and, you know, you can also make art about that. So how are we gonna fix this problem? Like how to end capitalism? Oh, well, for that, I've reached the same conclusion that several other YouTubers have. And that conclusion is that I have no fucking clue, and probably shouldn't be the one to tell you. I make YouTube videos about video games. That's something we're all just going to need to decide as a community. But let's say you do want to do something. You want to see the video games industry get better. Well, I mean, I guess you could make some paintings of banks catching on fire using the medium of mixology, but let's say you don't want to, you know, go to jail. Maybe you want to work within the system to make change. And also, maybe you just don't give a fuck about ending capitalism and just want the video games industry to be less exploitative and shit. Well, I mean, a good thing to do is to just talk about these things, you know, let people know what's going on and why it's bad. Most people will agree these things are bad. And, like I said earlier, the more people who believe something is bad, the less a company can get away with it. And you can just, you know, not buy these games. If you really want to play them, you can play them at a friend's house. And sure, with technology getting better, games companies are making it harder for your friends to get a hold of games. But even if you don't play them at all, you're probably not going to be missing out on a whole ton. And of course, support the indies as much as you can. All summed up, put your money where your mouth is. That's the system we live in, and if we want to work within it, that's the only tool we have. Even if it clearly isn't enough, especially when not buying AAA games doesn't really affect the companies who get more money from taxes in a year than you could spend in multiple lifetimes. I mean, I'm gonna be real, I don't get why all these rich people keep complaining about socialism, because it seems to be working pretty well for them. Really, the most effective thing to do inside the system seems to be talking shit on Twitter about Bobby Kotick, Neil Druckmann, Rowdy Randy, Andrew Wilson, Marcin Inowinski, and Adam Kaczynski, and very much Yves Guillemot. Because remember, corporations are not amorphous blobs of evil where it is simply in their nature to do bad. Certainly, the system we live under that allows and encourages them to do bad needs to change, but as the system stands, I do think we should remember, these companies are run by people who decide to do bad things. And because they are human, we all know they are and have been capable of doing good or even neutral things, but instead decided not to. But even then, the people you are harassing aren't going to be these people. They're going to be interns who really don't get paid. And yeah, I guess don't bootlick. You're not going to get anything out of that. The only people who win in that scenario are the serial abusers you're defending, and they're not going to notice you. And well, that's not very much, is it? I mean, I feel like I've given myself a monumental question to answer, one for which there's very little precedent that doesn't involve a guillotine, which, well, no, again, that would be technically working outside the system. Fuck, like, how do you, a person, singularly fight against an industry in a system that is run by people who own industries and therefore build the entire society around never being able to fight against an industry? So, you know, whatever you do can either be ignored by the people in power, apologized for, and then ignored by the people in power, have the people in power who could do something stand in solidarity with you because they don't actually want to do anything, or pretend they just have no idea what you're asking for when it couldn't be more clear, but that they just don't want to do the thing that you're asking for.
What reform do you want?
Defunding them, dude. Defund them.
What do you want?
I want to defund the police.
It's a blank piece of paper.
All right, you write -$6 billion.
Yeah, I kind of did run myself into a wall here asking this question and trying to answer it. Fuck. Oh, support game workers unionizing. Thankfully, there have been some big pushes towards that, with the Game Workers Unite movement, and in January, the Communications Workers of America launched a campaign to get the games industry unionized, so, I mean, there's a little spice of hope. And the reason they're doing this is because, you know, it was laid bare just how bad shit was getting. So if we keep shouting, things fucking happen. And, I mean, yeah, maybe getting the word out might not be the most praxisist thing to do, sure, but it's something, and even if you don't give a shit about that, or even if you don't give a shit about how workers are treated, and whether or not they're sexually assaulted, well, if you don't buy AAA games, unfortunately all you get out of this is, well, you just end up playing better video games, with more heart that will make you feel more, expose you to more voices, give you more freedom, tell better stories, and ultimately be more creative than the AAA games could ever hope to be. Also costs less money to buy. I should have mentioned that one. So this video took a while. I did a lot of research, a lot of looking into things, and a lot of learning. And I have come away with a very simple conclusion. Valve is the one good AAA company, baby! They make some of the best fucking games you'll ever play. They said crunch was not useful, made constant sales such a standard in the industry, people need to compete by giving games away for free, their games get updates decades after release, they allow people to just fucking publish indie games using their IPs on their platform, and let people charge money for them. Even if they're fucking trash, cause they know that shit don't devalue squat. They just said fuck copyright law. Valve's relationship with sexual harassment is that they removed the voice lines of a sexual harasser from Dota. The worst thing they ever did was make a card game. We stand a fucking king. There is ethical consumption under capitalism, and that is paying Gaben to fuck your wife. Hey guys, thanks for watching the video, and remember to comment, subscribe, and God fucking damn it. How do I keep doing this? This is like the easiest fucking part of the goddamn video. We have a Discord that you can join if you want to hang out and get updates and shit. Patreon!